Good morning, everyone. This is Jerrold Green from the Pacific Council, and I want to welcome you to what is for us, particularly at the Council, a very special event. I want to begin by thanking yet again Dr. Brad Edgerton and Louise Edgerton for not only supporting our Edgerton series on China, but helping us to craft the series and to decide that the series would focus on China. Brad was fairly prescient, and as when we cooked this up, our relationship with China is not as it is today, but he sort of predicted it. So Brad and Louise, thank you for doing this. The reason I was especially eager to welcome everyone to this event is because we're featuring my predecessor as CEO of the Pacific Council, Dr. Geoff Garrett, Dean Geoff Garrett, who was recently returned to Los Angeles in his role as Dean at the Marshall School of Business at the University of Southern California. Geoff returned to LA after being Dean of the Business School at Wharton, and we are really, SC and LA are really lucky to have him, as is the Pacific Council. We're enjoying the return of our prodigal sibling. I took over the Pacific Council in 2008, which if I was really smart, I probably would not have done it. It was a time that was as difficult economically as today, and frankly, more difficult. But I really owe a debt of gratitude to my predecessor, Geoff Garrett, and Jennifer Faust, who's going to be moderating this session today. Because Jen worked with Geoff, and she now works with me as our executive director. And because of Geoff and Jen and a couple of others, including a number of our directors, we really weathered 2008. We survived 2008, which many of our peers didn't. So I've never actually thanked Geoff for leaving me an organization in such good health. And I thank Jen on a daily basis because she's our executive director, and anything good that happens, you can track it back to Jen. Final point, I first met Geoff when I met Brad Edgerton in Alex Capello's office, who's a member of our former member of our board, to talk about Iran. So it's been a long, circuitous route through then. Geoff went back to Australia for a few years after leaving the council, then back to Wharton. He has deep roots in LA. He was the head of all international activities at UCLA. So he's dual-hatted both at SC and UCLA, and really is a great addition to our community, our robust international affairs community here in LA. Geoff, thank you for doing this. Jen, thank you for all that you do. I'm going to turn it over to you and fade into the background.
Great. Well, thanks, Jerry, for the nice walk down memory lane. It really is a pleasure to have you here, Geoff, speaking to the Pacific Council members and our audience, both in Los Angeles. So good morning to everybody here on the West Coast, and those members and audience who are also spread across the US and internationally. Hello. Geoff, we have a couple of questions that you and I can go through to give our audience some things to think about as they prepare their own questions for you. On this particular session, we're actually going to be able to open up the mics for some members to actually ask their questions when we get to the general Q&A part, or allow people to indicate that they have a question by raising their hand or typing their question in the chat and the question box. So I encourage everybody who's listening to be thinking about those questions, because I know, Geoff, that you'd like to have a lot of back and forth with our audience. Before we get to those questions, I thought maybe we would just come back to present day. And actually, last night, we heard last night at the debates, for everyone who was watching them, we heard Vice President Pence blame China for the coronavirus. The question we have for you is, what is the coronavirus impact on our relations? What does this say about international cooperation?
Jen, that's a very big question, obviously, but let me first say, I mean, very briefly, it feels both weird and wonderful to be in this Pacific Council event today. And I remember very fondly some wonderful dinners I had with Brad and Louise Edgerton, talking about all things international and their commitment to moving the dial and moving the dial via the Pacific Council. So I'm really pleased to be part of their series. And I want to congratulate and thank you and Jerry for your leadership of the council over what has been a really difficult time. You know, when I left to go back to Australia to found an institute on the US, that was, I think I left LA in April 2008, and I did not know that Lehman Brothers was going to collapse on September 15th, 2008. And I mean, we were all worried about over leverage, but I don't think we anticipated that. And the fact that the council had not only survived but thrived is a testament to everybody, to the leadership and to the membership. So hats off to everybody, and I'm so pleased to be back here and to be part of that. On the question of what's the coronavirus done to US-China relations, you know, I think you could go very targeted and very macro. The very targeted is that we're in this spat, the sort of blame game spat between the US and China over who caused the virus and who's responsible for its going global. And as I mentioned to you in the green room, Council on Foreign Relations came out with a report this morning saying that they think that their conclusion was something like China wasn't fully forthright about the virus in January, and the World Health Organization probably was a bit too accepting of China's desire to have some confidentiality around the crisis in the early stages, right? So you know, that's not as extreme as the Trump administration's charge that we heard last night from the vice president, but it's consistent with that. So that's very micro. If we go very macro, I think the lesson that the US is drawing from the crisis is it's underscoring American instincts towards isolation, that the rest of the world is a problem, not an opportunity, and people from the rest of the world are a problem. So, you know, the economics of that, I think, is about decoupling and reducing the length of supply chains and stuff we should talk about. But I am struck by the fact that China is coming out of the economic crisis more quickly has clearly empowered Xi Jinping to be even more aggressive on the global stage. So in the US, we hear a lot about wolf warrior diplomacy and the sort of uglier face of that. But I think it's also true that China is just pressing on all dimensions now internationally, because they see not only an absence of US leadership, but an unwillingness of the US to play a global leadership role.
Okay, but we've heard so much about this. Last night in the debate, actually, China loomed pretty large in terms of the foreign policy questions that were asked. So I also want to turn to what we heard from the other vice president candidate. She claimed in the debate that the US is losing the trade war. How is the US-China trade deal going?
I was so frustrated by that conversation because it was so disconnected from these really profound economic realities in the US-China relationship. And I don't know what you were watching afterwards, but I was on CNN, and CNN fact-checked this. And the fact checker said, listen, there was a lot of spurious, if not specious stuff about winning and losing the trade war. So what's actually going on? I'd commend to people who are interested, the Peterson Institute updates as frequently as they can how closely China is sticking to its commitment to increase the purchase of American products by $200 billion by the end of 2021. And the simple summary is China is not living up to its phase one commitments. You know, maybe at the 50% or roughly that, of 50% of what you would expect to have happened today, with the interesting exception that the only product category where China is buying more from the US is semiconductors. the precise industry that the US wants to restrict Chinese access to. So that's really interesting. But the second thing that I don't think anyone is paying attention to is the fact that the US-China trade deficit has come down enormously in the past 18 months. It was about $75 billion lower in 2019 than 2018. And it looks like that trajectory is going to continue in this pandemic year. So that raises a really interesting challenge, I think, for the US, probably not in the next month, but in the next 12 months, which is China is not going to meet its phase one commitments, but the object of the trade war, which was to reduce the trade deficit, is actually happening on a pretty large scale. But note, it's how can those two things be true? How can China not be meeting its commitments, but the trade deficit is going down? The answer is that America is buying many fewer Chinese products than it did in the last several years. So American exports haven't gone up in the way that the administration hoped, but American imports have gone way down. So the trade deficit has gone down.
Could you also explain a little bit more about what comes next if they don't meet the phase one commitments? What do you expect would be the US reaction or the world reaction on that?
Well, I think the US is going to have a really important decision to make, right? One would be to say, and I would imagine this would be the instinct of a Trump second term. We held China's feet to the fire. They didn't deliver. That now gives us the green light to do more tariffs or anything else we want to do to punish China, because we gave them this 2-year opportunity and they didn't deliver. But another perspective that maybe the Biden administration would take is, we understand why China couldn't deliver, because demand in China wasn't high enough. They couldn't buy American products because we're in a very deep recession. And what we were really concerned about was the bilateral trade imbalance, and the trade imbalance has come down a long way. So yes, China didn't meet the letter of the deal, but our broader objective is being furthered. So let's forgive China in some sense for not fulfilling their formal requirements. So I think that's a big decision. The way the deal is structured, I don't think you have to take formal action until the end of 2021. But the Trump administration was thinking of having close to a summit with China on progress on phase one. And I was worried that they were going to call China out for non-compliance. But those meetings didn't happen. So even the Trump administration has decided, I think, reading between the lines, not to play the card yet that China is not meeting its phase one obligations.
Okay. What about the things we've been hearing about the supply chains and decoupling from China? Is that realistic? And what does a timeline like that even look like if that's pursued?
This is the biggest story economically. I think this notion that we should decouple the supply chain for some combination of commercial rivalry reasons, but also national security, right? That's the new theme of the last 12 months or so. Three things about decoupling. First, it's actually going to be really hard to do. And I've seen surveys that say that American companies are still using the Chinese supply chain. They just want to try to fly under the political radar a little bit if they can do that, right? And certainly if you look at somebody like Tim Cook, the CEO of Apple, he would say, we're in China, we assemble our products in China because their tooling engineers are better than anywhere else in the world. We're not doing it for price, we're doing it for quality. Maybe Apple's an extreme example there, but certainly the evidence says that American firms that have deep supply chain connections in China are either unwilling or unable to unwind them quickly. Second observation is that if we get out of this China supply chain business, other countries can pick up the slack. Now, they can't pick up all the China slack, the three biggest winners thus far have been Vietnam on the cost side,
Mhm.
Taiwan on the tech side, in particular semiconductors, and third, Mexico for geographic proximity. So I think there are probably a lot of business opportunities out there for firms to reorient their supply chains, at least in a redundancy sense, right? You can't put all your eggs in the China basket. You need to have some other countries involved. And those are the three big winners. But down the road, there could be other big winners. India is an obvious one where there's a lot of investment now. And I think a bunch of that is premised on the notion that US-China is just going to be different going forward, and that'll create opportunities for India. But then the third point, and the one that just perplexes me the most about politics, although Kamala Harris mentioned it last night, is the cost implications for American consumers of getting out of the China supply chain business. So I saw the FT has this thing called Trade Secrets that they publish every day, and I thought there was a fantastic trade secrets graph this week that said their estimate of average manufacturing costs is that average manufacturing costs are 35% higher in the US than in China when you take everything into account. And I think that actually it's more than manufacturing costs, it's to deliver the products in the United States, it would still cost 35% more. So what I don't understand is why the cost to the American consumer of decoupling isn't a core part of the political argument, right? The political argument is all about jobs and exports.
Yep.
It's not about the benefits that all American citizens have received from the Chinese supply chain.
Mm-hmm. Yes, it's really fascinating. Here at the Pacific Council, we have some projects that really focus on Mexico. So looking at that chart from the FT and thinking about how, over the long run, this potential decoupling from supply chains in China is going to affect our neighbor to the south is something that we're thinking about here at the Pacific Council. So remains to be seen. You brought up national security when it comes to economics. So let's switch over there, because national security does loom pretty large in a couple different ways, thinking about 5G in particular and the geopolitics that are at play there. What can you tell us about the US campaign against Huawei and what the whole international stage looks like?
Yeah, I wrote something a long time ago now where I used the term the war on Huawei. And at the time, people thought that was a bit histrionic, even though it was alliteratively attractive to me. But it does look like there's a war on Huawei. So Huawei, by the way, I think is quite different from the TikTok, WeChat discussion that maybe we should have. The story with Huawei is about 5G backbone. And and you can see that there's just a more natural national security question where we're talking about infrastructure and 5G infrastructure in particular. But when I look at 5G, the first thing that strikes me is the fact that there aren't leading American players in 5G. We think this is a transformative technology, but the American companies that are involved, and I think Intel and Qualcomm are the two biggest, are suppliers of components. They're not offering integrated solutions. So if you look at integrated solutions for 5G, the leader is China, led by Huawei. And then the next alternative is some combination of Ericsson and Nokia from Europe. There's not an American 5G. And I think we should all reflect on that. How can it be that the most innovative economy in the world, the leading economy in the world, is not placed? Not only won't the US dominate 5G, it doesn't even really have a player in 5G. So I think that's an important question. Second, if you look at the geopolitics of Huawei right now, obviously the US is pressuring everybody to keep Huawei out of the supply chain. And they're doing it not only rhetorically, but now by having these indirect pathways by which you could be hurt economically if you have Huawei in your 5G. But the US strategy began with the so-called Five Eyes, the intelligence Five Eyes. So that's the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, UK. And the UK actually took quite a while, as I think we know, to come around to the US position, but it looks like Boris Johnson has done that now. The game has moved to Europe, where I think Germany is obviously the most important player. And of course, Germany's position is difficult because China is Germany's biggest export market. So taking the US side on keeping Huawei out of 5G potentially is a risky thing for Germany to do. But if you look beyond that, I would expect that most of the rest of the world is going to use Huawei as 5G backbone for two reasons. It's cheaper and it's already installed, or at least it's begun to be installed. So I was struck, I think it's in the last 12 months, the Philippines came out and said, we're going to use Huawei for our 5G. Why am I struck by the Philippines? Well, the Philippines was the country that took China to the International Court of Justice over the South China Sea. So it's not like, it's not like in a national security sense, the Philippines and China are on the same page. But when it came to 5G, Philippines said, we're going to embrace Huawei. So I think the national security is everywhere in these advanced technology cases, because everything that has a business application also has a national security implication. I do think Huawei is the biggest example, but it's the tip of the iceberg there. And I'm not sure that the US position is going to be globally adopted. So that's a long-winded summary of the war on Huawei.
Okay. It's interesting to hear it all summed up so nicely like that, Geoff. I do have a couple more questions for you, but I want to again stop and remind the audience that we'll be doing audience questions pretty soon. So get those prepared as you're thinking about what you're hearing here from Geoff. Geoff, I want to switch over to you brought up WeChat, and that makes me think of all the socio-cultural impacts on economics. Recent news has covered what the NBA has been doing in China, standing up for their players and what they're doing there. Disney came under fire because of the recognition of Xinjiang in the Mulan credits. What can we expect in the future about companies impacting the socioeconomic parts of what's going on with their relations with China?
Yeah, so I mean, those two examples, Jen, are perfect ones because they get to, we've talked about economics and national security, but now we've added a third element, which is culture. And for those of us who embrace cosmopolitanism, I think it's worrying in both countries if we have a more nationalist approach to culture, both countries, China and the US. But let's add an additional element to culture now, which I think is data, and that's what comes up in the TikTok and WeChat cases, which obviously are cultural phenomena, right? I mean, I think TikTok's the #1 downloaded app in 2020, and so many people in the US, including myself, interact with people in China using WeChat. The Trump administration's claim on both WeChat and TikTok is essentially the same, and the claim is that data is a national security risk. Now, that I can see that if you got to banking information and other things that obviously we really are concerned about data security. But in the case of TikTok and WeChat, we don't really see that so much. It's really about user habits. And obviously all the tech companies, we all sign away our rights to all the tech companies so that they can monitor our habits, because then they can target stuff better to us. Now, is that good for us or is it bad for us? Obviously, that's a very big question. But on the face of it, it doesn't look like these Chinese companies are so different from Facebook. They just happen to be Chinese companies. And whether that one, there's a lot of concerns about the so-called TikTok deal. Would Oracle really gain control? Is China going to allow this transaction to go through? There's a lot of stuff there. The WeChat is less advanced, but it's going to be interesting to see whether the Trump administration can hold to this line that says these companies are bad for American national security, because the case just is less obvious than it is in the Huawei case. If you go back to things like the NBA, I mean, I think what both of these, the Mulan and NBA, say to me is that these American industries are global industries, and the Chinese market is probably the second most important market outside the US. So clearly big American multinational firms and multinational organizations like the NBA want the Chinese marketplace. How much they should bend to Chinese preferences and in some cases Chinese restrictions is obviously a much more difficult issue for them, but it just underscores the importance of the Chinese market.
Great. I do have a couple more questions for you, Geoff, but I also know that we're bumping up on time and you wanted to hear from the audience as well. We have the trifecta of Pacific Council presidents participating today, because I know Abe Lowenthal, who is our founding president of the Pacific Council, is in the audience and has a question, and we want to open up his mic so that he can ask you directly. Alex, would you please make that happen for Abe?
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hear you loud and clear. Great to hear you, if not see you.
Right.
Yes, well, I'm pleased to have this trifecta, as Jen put it, and welcome back to California and to USC. It's exciting for the university, and I hope the Pacific Council will continue to engage you as well. The question I had precisely is at the connecting point between Pacific Council and USC, and indeed UCLA as well, where you had a strong background. And it's in the context of US-China relations. Assuming that the United States may have a change of political leadership soon, which of course is an uncertain assumption, but looks more likely as the weeks go by. How would you think about how organizations like the Pacific Council and universities like USC and UCLA could play a larger and more effective role in helping people in Southern California and even beyond Southern California to respond more intelligently and constructively to the challenges and the opportunities presented by the role of China, ever more important in the world economy and in world geopolitics. You and I and Jerry have all given some thought to that, but it seems to me that this is a very timely moment to focus on that question.
Yeah, obviously it's a massive question, Abe, and let me begin by acknowledging that I think the core reason the US position has changed on China is not Donald Trump, it's Xi Jinping. And the view that Xi Jinping is a different kind of leader has really called into question the core assumption of American foreign policy towards China for 40 years, which was, if we engage with China more, ultimately China will become more like us. And I think Xi Jinping is just the exclamation point on the observation that China is changing a lot, but it's probably not becoming more like us, or at least in the core democratic sense that I think Bill Clinton anticipated when he supported Chinese entry into WTO in 2001. So that whole notion that engagement is the right strategy because it's going to change China, I think we've got to rethink that. Now, I still think engagement is the right strategy, but not because it's going to change China necessarily. It seems to me that there are two other reasons why we should continue to engage with China. The first one is economic. I think the economic benefits are large, and I don't think corporate leaders or political leaders have done a very good job of explaining that. The corporate leaders I believe, have been a little more cynical. They want to do a lot of business in China and with China. They just don't want the public to know about that. I think that's got to change. I think we need to have more leaders who are more willing to talk about the real benefits, not only for American corporations, but for American citizens and consumers from China. But the second thing, you know, I'm a Kantian at heart, I guess, on this dimension. And I really think that engagement is the best ballast we've got against military conflict between China and the US. The two countries don't see eye to eye on a lot of things. There are lots of disagreements that could become flashpoints. I just really believe that engagement is ballast against that. And if we decouple, the world's going to be a very different place. So I've always said US-China cannot be a second Cold War because of the massive economic interconnections between China and the US. Well, China and the US can become a second Cold War if the two economies decouple, if we create two global economies. So at the highest level, you know, I think we need to rebase the case for engagement. And it's probably, Abe, you saw this 20 plus years ago. It's probably easier to make that, to rebase the case if you're not in Washington, if you're not in the Northeast, because I think we just have a broader and better perspective on what China means on the West Coast. With respect to universities, I'm really concerned about everything, and not just the business model of American universities, particularly public universities, which increasingly relies on full fee paying Chinese students. I'm worried about the loss of intercultural understanding that would come from a disengagement. If the disengagement with China extended to universities, I think we just lose that possibility for shared understanding and developing shared understanding. And that, to my mind, that'd be a tragedy. But I also, you know, I just feel for our Chinese students on a daily basis. You know, the president and the secretary of state have not quite said, be worried that all of our Chinese students could be spies, but they've gotten pretty close to that. And I just feel for our Chinese students in that environment. You know, the Chinese students I know come to the US because they want a great education and they want to improve their lives, and maybe they want to try to stay in the US, maybe they want to go back to China, maybe they want a global life, but they're doing this for all the right reasons. And the fact now that their reasoning might be impugned, I think is just a terrible thing. With respect to university strategy, you know, a quote that I've drawn on a lot this year is an old Winston Churchill quote. Churchill seemed to have had quotes on everything, but one thing he said was, if you want to fly a kite, you fly it into the wind, not with the wind. And, you know, flying the kite of engagement with China in the current geopolitical environment might seem risky because there are a lot of headwinds, but I think there's a chance it can soar in this environment if we get the narrative right. And I don't think the narrative can be naive, right? You've got to be willing to talk about Hong Kong and Taiwan and Xinjiang and all of the other concerns we have about the Chinese government. You can't bury your head in the sand on those. But I also think, to use another old metaphor, you shouldn't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot else that comes positively from the US-China relationship that I think we just need to appreciate more and build on more. But again, in an optimistic way, but a way that's realistic and not naive. It's not going to be an easy path. And one reason it's not going to be an easy path, you mentioned, Dave, the election. You know, I think what Joe Biden has said about China on the campaign trail is probably close to the way that he would govern with respect to China, which is to say, the Trump administration was right to be tough on China. I'm just going to engage our allies much more in that. That would be my one sentence summary of the Biden position on China. Remember, the first clause there is, I think the Trump administration was right to be tough on China for economic, human rights, and national security reasons. So that is the consensus. I think that's the consensus position in DC right now. And I'd like to see if we could get a little more nuance into that position.
Interesting. Thanks, Geoff. And thanks for the question, Abe. I know we have another question queued up. Alex, would you open the mic for Josh? And Josh, please introduce yourself.
Hi, Jen, and thank you, Dr. Garrett. My name is Josh Kirschenbaum. I'm based here in Los Angeles and work in financial crime compliance at a regional bank, and I'm a former think tanker at the German Marshall Fund, a non-resident fellow now, and don't work too much on China issues, but follow it closely out of interest in economics and national security. Two questions for you, just to ask you to elaborate on your opening or introductory remarks. The first is your brief comment about the US lacking a leader in 5G backbone. Do you think that's significant? Is there a big lesson there? Is it just, some of the stuff I've read is about regulatory problems with frequencies and bandwidth here? Is it a deeper R&D or industrial policy problem that we don't have a leader in that, or you just can't lead in everything? Second question is about your brief remark about decoupling the supply chain will be hard. Tim Cook says it's impossible. Does hard mean hard, or does hard mean impossible? And are you opposed to it because you actually think it's economically impossible, or you think the national security concerns are simply overwrought or unwise? In other words, can it not be done, or simply should it not be done? Thank you.
Josh, thanks for the questions. They're both massive questions, of course. So let me see if I can be reasonably pithy on them, maybe in reverse order. Can you unwind supply chains? Probably yes, but it takes time to do that, particularly if you're talking about lots of factories, right? These are complex networks, and we know that infrastructure is better in China than anywhere else in the world. You move it to Vietnam, do you have all of the infrastructure that exists in Guangdong province? The answer is no. So you can do it. It'll take time. I think most firms will want to hedge and have more redundancy in their supply chain, so they'll have a non-China option. What are the consequences of that? The consequences, as I said, depend on where the supply chain goes. And this thing that Jen and I were talking about in the FT noted that manufacturing costs plus, I think, this delivery, getting it into the US, is actually much lower in Mexico than even in China. So it would cost you, I think their estimate was, it would cost you 35 cents in the dollar to move something to the US, but you might save 25 cents in the dollar moving it from China to Mexico, an incredible opportunity for Mexico. I do think that, you didn't quite ask this, but I think this focus on made in America is just economically crazy because there are so few products in the modern world economy that are made in any one country. Certainly even, not even complex products, but certainly the more complex they become, the more global they tend to be. So I saw an estimate recently, and this Mexico obviously looms large here, in what's the most American car. And this was by value of components, right? How many of the value of the components summed by where they were produced. And the most American car, according to this estimate, was only 70% American. So that's why I think it's weird that we use automobiles as we want the American automaker to be back. We want the manufacturing jobs in Detroit, all of that stuff. Automobiles are about the most globally produced product there is. And so made in America just doesn't make sense there. So you didn't ask about made in America, but the supply chain depends on where you go, how efficient it is. But I think this naive made in America is better. I can understand the political reasons not to take that on, but from an economic standpoint, it just doesn't make a lot of sense. First question about why is the US not a player in 5G? You mentioned regulatory stuff and federalism, and all of those things are no doubt relevant, but let me go really big picture here. My really big picture is that the US created Silicon Valley for national security reasons, right? The internet, the first name of the internet was DARPANET, and the D in DARPA was defense. The internet is a US Defense Department funded product. After the end of the Cold War, the US got out of the R&D business for national security reasons, right? Because we'd won the Cold War, and we fell in love with the idea that Silicon Valley could do all of its R&D. I just think that's a little bit naive if we look back at the history of Silicon Valley, where the Department of Energy and the Department of Defense were critical funders of the core technology that then Silicon Valley entrepreneurs could take advantage of and brilliantly take advantage of. So for me, 5G is a wake-up call. If this is one of the most important technological advances of the decade, and it's not being led by the United States, we should ask the question why and be pretty concerned about that.
Okay. While you were talking, Geoff, I noticed that there's another question that's come up from the audience. The person doesn't identify themselves, but they ask a couple different things. I'm just going to sum up two of the points that I've heard from you. One is about the data sets and Chinese companies collecting user behavior. It's a larger question, but that's the theme of it. And the second one is about students again, and I think this is one that you could probably help us unpack. This person asks about Chinese students learning advanced technology here in the United States, and then potentially going back to the home country or working for government or doing something else that could be more in the sort of spy nature of things. So there was a third question in there too. Why can't the benefits to American consumers be gained from other trading relationships? But I'm not sure how. Why don't you pick which order or which section?
Well, let me pick the one in the middle, Jen, which I think is a
Okay.
really important question. So the question was, if a Chinese student comes to the United States and studies in an AI lab
Yep.
At an American university, they come to USC, they go to the Viterbi school, they're really good at computer science and AI, and then the person goes back to China. We are now calling that a national security risk. In most other contexts, we'd call that development, and we'd be really happy about it, right? That it's win-win, that we got to educate this person. The person took some of what they learned back to their home country. Maybe that then created connections with an American firm. That country would win, we'd win, right? It's a win-win-win. What we're now saying is we've just got to shut the door to that because of the national security risk. So the only reason to highlight that is that it's a pretty extreme position. That, if you look at what has been the broad view in the United States to why we should educate international students. The broad view has been, it's a win-win. It's good for them and it's good for us. And right now we're saying with Chinese students, it's good for them and it's good for China, but it's bad for us. So that's a pretty stark departure from the way we have thought about international students. And I remember, look, I was in the US as a student while the Cold War was still going on. And even then we had lots of targeted programs, not so much for Soviet students at the time, but for Chinese students as the US was trying to engage with China. So even in that period, we thought it was important to educate the coming Chinese elite because maybe again, because we thought it would change China. But now we've reversed that educating the Chinese elite is both a commercial and, more importantly, a national security risk to the United States. And I think we should just call out how stark a change that is, or how stark an amendment it is to our broad view about the benefits of international education.
Thanks for that, Geoff. Not sure if you were following, you're talking about the students and the people-to-people exchanges in addition to the development of a country by having that experience, I think is really important. But I'm not sure if you were watching. I'm a former Peace Corps volunteer, so I took note when the Peace Corps removed all of its Peace Corps volunteers preemptively from China. This was prior to coronavirus, but it got caught up in the news. It didn't get much notice because the decision was made independent of coronavirus, and then coronavirus hit. But I was actually on Capitol Hill with a lot of Peace Corps volunteers after that, talking to our legislature about why it's important to have these connections between two countries, especially the United States and China, and having a whole a whole host of young Americans who are fluent in the culture and the language and understand things that can help over the long run in terms of making these connections back and forth. So it's not just the Chinese elite getting the experience in the United States, but also Americans doing the same thing, not just in China, but other countries. But that was definitely seen as a casualty of this current administration's stance on how to connect with China.
This is a case, Jen, thanks for raising it. I think it's a very important one where, again, I'm not an apologist for the Chinese government. As you know, the Chinese government did a crackdown on NGOs beginning about 5 years ago, and just much more stringent regulation. And I think they even moved it from a commercial entity, the Chinese entity that regulates NGOs, went from being commercial to being closer to national security, because the Chinese government obviously was concerned about pro-human rights organizations in China, and they wanted to regulate them more, right? So I'm not surprised the Peace Corps would decide to leave China, because the regulatory environment in China changed for the worse in the previous 5 years. But I think that, this just reminds me of, I think, my broadest feeling, and I'm sure many people in the audience have this feeling too, from knowing Chinese people spending time in China. Most Chinese people aren't very happy with the government. They have to live with the government, they have to work with the government, they have to work around the government. But what I see, again, I'll go a little businessy. What I see in the Chinese private sector is incredible entrepreneurship and innovation, where people want to lead better lives and they want to make positive contributions to society. Just the way we think of entrepreneurs and innovators in this country. The problem right now is that all of that gets caught up in the geopolitical crossfire. So I think on a business side, we don't take seriously, for example, just how impressive a company Alibaba or Tencent is, right? We would say they can't be very good because they live behind the Chinese Great Firewall, the internet firewall. Well, yeah, they live behind the internet firewall, but if you look at what they do, the end-to-endness of those companies is just extraordinary. There's nothing like that in the West, and we tend not to see that. I think we also tend not to see the drive, the ambition, the talent, the quality of Chinese entrepreneurs, right? What we see is the long arm of the state. And of course, the long arm of the state is everywhere, but people inside China have to live in that world. And I'm always just struck by both how pragmatically and how successfully they do that.
I think I have a few more questions that I prepared for you, Geoff, and we're wrapping up here. So I'll also ask you for the final takeaways or things that you want everybody to really get from this session as they walk away. I don't see any more questions populating the audience queue, but I'm happy to ask a question and see if there's any more, and then switch over if that makes sense. You talked a lot about, you covered a lot of ground here, but I'd like to maybe think more about the general strategic position worldwide that we see China taking, and all of the conversations we have about great power dynamics and U.S. standing versus China standing, or other leaders around the world. What do you think? What do you think we should be thinking about the future of China in its place in the world?
I said that China views right now as an opportunity, and I think that's pretty clear, right? The US is pulling back from the world. Xi Jinping wants to be seen as a global leader. I mean, the famous pivot moment, I think, was whatever inauguration day was in 2017. Xi Jinping was in Davos saying, "I'm the defender of globalization," while Donald Trump was saying that we want to be America first in his inauguration address, right? That was a big pivot moment. I think coronavirus the Chinese government's doubling down, right? They think that the US is incapacitated and that all of the insularity in the US is even more extreme now, and this is an opportunity for China. I believe China is overplaying its hand, but I do think that some of the criticisms of that in the West are overblown. So let's talk about something we haven't discussed yet, the Belt and Road Initiative, this, the Chinese version of the Marshall Plan, something that the Chinese don't like to associate. They don't like to associate Belt and Road with Marshall Plan, but I think it's the comp, right? And what the Chinese government is saying to the rest of the world is, we're really good at infrastructure. You need infrastructure. We'll lend you money and we'll build the infrastructure for you. You know, that's at the highest level, that's a compelling proposition for most of the world, because they can't do the infrastructure themselves and the World Bank isn't paying for it. Has China overplayed its hand in Belt and Road? Yeah, I think they have. You know, in Africa, it was too Chinese. There were too many Chinese workers. They should have used more African workers. They would have carried much more support if they'd done that. My sense is that China is learning from that. And if you look at the way that they're trying to do Belt and Road projects in Central Asia and in Eastern Europe and in Italy, by the way, which is signed on to Belt and Road, I think they're going to be a lot more sensitive going forward to having local partners in those projects. So what I would say, let me scope out for a second and just say that we tend to think about Chinese international expansion as being in the national security realm. When we look at Chinese defense expenditures, most of that is pretty regionally focused. And obviously it's naval, it's off the coast of China. The China goes global has been geoeconomic, not geopolitical, where Belt and Road plus Chinese investment plus Chinese trade, that's been the big story. And I think that's going to continue. So that'd be my summary, that let's not think that Chinese expansion is led by military. I think it's led by economics. In terms of flashpoints going forward, there's one obvious one, which is the future of Taiwan. And I've always worried, and certainly I know a lot of other people who worry that whenever Xi Jinping's term as president ends, he would like nothing more than his final act to be the reintegration of Taiwan into China. And, you know, what would happen in that moment, we don't know. But I think many of the members probably read Richard Haas's recommendation to the US to try to forestall that by saying to the Chinese right now, if you invade Taiwan to reintegrate them, we're going to react militarily, right? As a way just to cut that pathway off. So I don't know how, I don't think Taiwan is a next 12 months, 2 years problem. But if you take a longer perspective on the decade, I think it's likely that Taiwan will be a flashpoint, and you know, let's hope we can manage that. Everyone can manage that as well as possible. The other one that I'm concerned about, big one I'm concerned about, is the reserve currency status of the US dollar. And I don't think there's any chance that the dollar gets replaced by the RMB as the global reserve currency. But I do think we all need to acknowledge the risk that the US is running right now, right? The US can run a ridiculously expansionary fiscal and monetary policy because people still view the US as a reserve currency, which means they'll still invest in US bonds and they'll still give the US really low interest rates. That is an incredible advantage for the US. If the US's economic position deteriorates to the point where the dollar is just like the euro or the RMB, and it's really traded freely, it's not a place people go to in a crisis as a safe haven, that could undermine the entire macroeconomic strategy of the US at the moment, which is that so many people are saying, hey, we can borrow money with impunity. Of course, we're going to borrow money. The world's letting us do that, and we can do it at zero interest rates forever. And let's not worry so much about deficits, and we don't have to worry about the size of the Federal Reserve balance sheet. If that one changes, that changes everything for America. So if I think about the next decade, where US-China are concerned, I think that the geopolitical issue is likely to be Taiwan. If I look geoeconomics, I think the looming challenge for the US is the status of the dollar. And a bunch of people have started to say that. Ray Dalio, Bridgewater has said that, and Ray he's a longtime China hand. A lot of investments for Bridgewater in China. People are starting to worry about that, and I think they're right to worry. You don't just have to be an investor type to be concerned about that.
Well, you've given us a lot to consider here, Geoff. These last two sort of clarion calls around Taiwan and currency issues and what happens to the dollar are things that we'll all be thinking about in the, definitely the moments after this and the week to come and more. You spoke a lot about decoupling. You spoke a lot about 5G. And then I think you gave us all some really good insights into what to expect with future generations when it comes to the student exchanges between the United States and China. If you wanted to have one takeaway or one thing that somebody who's participated in this session should really be focusing on as they leave today, what do you think that would be, or what do you want to reinforce from what you've already said?
I think, Jen, first of all, thanks for the conversation. It's been great, and the questions from the floor were tremendous. I want to go back to my response to Abe Lowenthal. Mm-hmm. I think the biggest issue is that the American argument for 40 years, engagement with China is good because it's going to change China and make them more democratic, right? That one is gone. So I think the challenge for those of us who believe in engagement with China is to defend engagement for reasons other than it's going to make China democratic. And the three that I would rely on are: one, intercultural understanding is so important. We need more of that, not less of that. Two, the economic relationship actually benefits Americans in lots of ways. Let's be really clear about them. And three, economic engagement is ballast to reduce the possibility of military conflict. And what could be more important than that? So I think we need an argument that doesn't rely on engagement will turn China into a democracy, because politically that doesn't look like anyone believes it today, and there's reason not to believe it, because the trajectory in China since 2012 has not been in a democratic direction.
Okay, some words for us to ponder. I like that wrap up, Geoff. Thank you also for today's conversation. I think we've given our audience a tour de force, and the questions that came in from them were really stimulating as well. So with that, I think we're 2 minutes under the hour, and we can wrap up our session. So thanks once again, Geoff, for joining us.
Pleasure was all mine, and hi to everybody in the audience. Thanks for joining us.
All right. Thanks, everyone.